twin girls. Uh, Now we will hear from Miss Harrington, Miss Ruby Brown Harrington.
Thank you, Miss Fleming. Thank you so much. And I just am happy to be with you all today and look forward to our conversation as we talk about a topic that I don't think happens enough in the Black community, particularly in the Black church. And so I do want to recognize your pastor that's here today. Thank you, sir, for allowing me to stand before your congregation virtually to talk about this. Reverend Newkirk, yes, thank you, sir. And I hope that we all walk away today learning something from each other and from this information. And I think that it will allow you to have some tips to determine how Oak City Baptist can support individuals living with mental illness. And so that said, I just want to let you all know I am recording. I just started the recording of this so that it can be made available to um, individuals that aren't able to be with you today. And I'll make this link available to Whitney as along with a copy of the handouts that I'm sharing. Okay. So I'm just going to move some of my technology stuff around here real quick. Let me get this screen shared. Oops, it always jumps folks back over. I don't, there we go. Okay. And so, as we talk about mental health in the Black community, I really want us to think about the prayer that was prayed for us about having open hearts and minds, because recognizing that many of us have not talked about topics around mental health, particularly suicide, and allowing your hearts to be open just to consider the information that's being shared with you today. And so I'd like to start out with this first slide because I think it's a great image of what we initially see when we interact with someone that may be experiencing a mental health problem. Oftentimes we see this little red bubble that's anger. It may also be other behaviors, acting out risky behaviors. So not necessarily anger, but we focused on that outward behavior. But I want you to take a moment to think about, instead of focusing on that outward behavior, what is the underlying issue, right? So what's causing those outward behaviors that we're seeing? And on this graphic, it has a variety of those things that an individual may be experiencing. There's fear, there's loneliness, there's depression, outrage at injustice, especially now in the times that we're living in. There may be guilt, shame, sadness, hurt. And so just rather than focusing on the behavior, take a moment to pause and think about what's causing that behavior so that we change how we interact with individuals that we come in contact with. And one of the things that I did want to make a note of, Whitney is going to be monitoring the chat room. So if you have questions, absolutely submit those to the chat room. And also, one thing that I forgot to mention when we first started, because we all have at some point dealt with hard situations, and we feel that we may be in a good place, but as conversations happen today, something may be stirred up, and you may feel some uncomfort and some type of emotion. And so what I ask that you do is please just pay attention for those feelings and reach out to any of the members of the wellness committee so that they can support you during this presentation today. All right. Now, can I just get a thumbs up from someone to make sure that you're seeing the slide with the bubble? Okay, thank you, Ms. Vernon. I appreciate that. because my little thing that shows up sometimes is not showing. So I was panicking for a moment there. All right, so let's talk about what mental illness is. And I like to start out with this so that we have a definition to understand as we move through the conversation so that we're all working from the same place. So we know that a mental illness is a diagnosable illness. And I want to pause there because oftentimes when we think particularly about stigma, various ideas come to mind, but it is a diagnosable illness. It is an illness of the brain. And so when we look at that, it's a diagnosable illness that affects three things: a person's thinking, their emotions, and their behavior. And so as we talk about anxiety and depression today, because they are two of the most common mental illnesses that we see in the Black community, we all have periods of anxiety. I have been a presenter of sorts for over 20 years, but even this morning when I got up and was getting myself together for this, I had some anxiousness. And so the difference between having anxiousness that's periodic, comes and goes, and having an anxiety disorder is that it starts to impact other areas of your life. So when it disrupts your ability to go to work or learn, so had I been so anxious this morning that I would not have been able to do this presentation, then I would have a conversation with my healthcare professional about those feelings. So when it disrupts their ability to go to work or learn, carry out your daily activities, or have satisfying relationships, then it's moving more from a period of anxiousness or sadness to a potential mental health problem or a potential mental illness. And so what I want you to think about as we go through today is not necessarily saying, oh, I think this person has depression, this person has anxiety, but recognizing that this individual is experiencing some problems that are impacting other areas in their lives. And I want to support them by having conversations and helping them connect to appropriate professional help. And so the context of this definition is that it impacts a person's ability to live, laugh, and love. That's the easier way to sum it up. So it's hard to always remember work and learn, satisfying relationships, and carry out daily activities. But if you think about live, laugh, love, and learn, that's usually a little bit easier for us to remember. And so what causes mental illness? Oftentimes, as folks think about this, it's a choice, and that ties into some of the stigma, or they want attention. But there are multiple causes of mental illness. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of those here for you today. So early life experiences, oftentimes, individuals, depending upon what they've experienced in life, it can lead to an increased risk for developing a mental health problem. You may have heard about this study that's been made really known in the media over the last few years, but it's a longevity study that's been around for decades. That's called the ACEs study, so Adverse Childhood Experiences, where it looks at an individual's early life experiences, and based upon the number of adverse life experiences during their childhood, it gives you an indicator of where they might potentially be developing mental health problems. So looking at those early life experiences, looking at substance overuse, that's another cause. And because it does, again, it's impacting the chemical makeup within the brain. Genetics, we know that there are mental illnesses that have genetic connections. So depression, for instance, if a parent has depression, there's a greater likelihood that their child will develop depression. There is a genetic connection between bipolar disorder as well as schizophrenia. And then also, if you have diabetes, or as we say in Sampson County, sugar, if you have high blood pressure, that does increase your likelihood for developing certain types of mental illnesses, particularly depression as it relates to um, diabetes and individuals with heart conditions. So there are studies that show that there are those genetic connections. Trauma and stress. if you are an individual that at some point in your life have been exposed to ongoing trauma and stress, and that could look like a lot of different things, from food insecurities to abusive family situation, that does increase your likelihood for developing a mental health problem. And then our environment, the things that are around us, and then biochemistry, tying back into the genetics piece that I just talked about. So there are a lot of things that can cause mental illnesses. And so just thinking about individuals that you may encounter in your congregation or even in your community and your family, thinking about some of these underlying issues or experiences that they've had and how they may impact their mental health or their mental wellness. So I like to take a moment to share some numbers with you. I think that it really gives you an idea of what we're really facing when we're talking about mental health in general, but also mental health in the Black community. And so, if you will, I'd like to just by show of hands, or if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should have a reaction button. So you can either use your real thumbs up in the screen, or use your reaction button to give a thumbs up. But how many of you have heard folks say Black folks don't get mental illness? I'm seeing those thumbs come up. Yes. Right. And so what I'm here to tell you today is that we do. I am an individual that lives with mental illness. I live with major depression, as does my daughter and my husband. And then my other daughter lives with anxiety. So we get it. We just don't talk about it, or we call it something else, because why risk saying, oh, I have depression, because then folks are going to look at me differently and judge us. So I want to share some numbers with you. And one of the reasons it's important for us to have this conversation is because of the numbers that I'm about to show you. So this shows an individual across the lifespan. So from an infant to an older adult. We know that 1/2 of all mental health issues start by age 14. So I want you to think about that. Think about those of you that have 14-year-olds in your house or in your life, right? Think about cousins, think about neighbors, think about your own children. 1/2 of all mental health problems start by age 14. 3/4 of them start by age 24. So if 75% of mental health problems start by the age of 24, it's imperative that we have a conversation so that we can support individuals. We create caring spaces, caring communities where they feel comfortable talking about the things that they're feeling and they're experiencing. And so given that 75% starting by age 24, 50% of us in our lifetime will experience a mental health problem or mental illness. 50%. When we look at adults, it's 1 in 5. So on my screen to my left, where I've got your pictures, I've got Miss Lindsay, Mr. Pope, Art Spire, Miss Stone, and Miss Fleming. So that's 5 folks. 1 in 5 out of that row will experience a mental health problem in any given year. So in a 12-month period, 1 out of those 5 names that I just called will experience a mental health problem. And that's everybody. That's not just Black folks. That's in general population. So 1 in 5. So it is happening. And we need to have these conversations so that we know what to look out for, so that we can have conversations with individuals and support them. So the next slide that I want to kind of touch on is, real quickly, this just kind of gives you an idea of what the breakdown is for mental disorders in a given year. Anxiety is the most common in adults, followed by major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. And so when we look down at the bottom where it has any mental disorder, and it's 18.5%, I'm not a mathematician. I can talk to you all day long about various things, but math is not my forte. But I do know enough to know that all of those disorders that are listed above that last row do not total up to be 18.5. And so what that any mental disorder at 18.5% means is that many individuals have more than one of those disorders that are listed on this particular slide. And so even more the reason why we should have this conversation. All right, let's see. So this slide, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time here, but I just wanna show you in this, in the left-hand corner in the green box where it points out substance use disorders in the United States. And so that gives you an idea of those numbers. And on the right-hand side, among those mental illnesses is a serious mental illness. So the number that I gave previously, 1 in 5, was just any mental illness. Serious mental illness includes schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorders. And so they're even more common. They're 1 in 4. But when we look at these numbers, when you have 19, and this was from 2018, when you have 19.1% of individuals 18 and over having a mental illness, that is a huge number because that comes down to 47.5 million people, almost 50 million people in the United States. Out of that 19.1%, only about 45% of them actually access services. And there are various reasons that they don't access services. And many times it's because of stigma, many times it's because of cost. But I want you to get an idea of, what we're talking about in the United States. But this is the one that I really want to spend a couple of minutes on. So this takes us to African Americans. So in the African American community, 2 in 9 have a serious mental illness. 2 in 9. It was 1 in 4 for the general population. And that's 16.2% or 4.8 million people. And so thinking about that, what does that mean for us? This breaks it down even easier. So when you look at those numbers, when the US population that identifies as Black or African American is only 13%, out of that 13% of us that are Black in this country, 16% of us have a mental illness in the past year. That's over 7 million people. And then for those of you that really want to make this connection, that's more than the populations of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia. 3 major cities in this country combined. We have more Black Americans living with a mental health problem than those 3 major cities. And so thinking about that and what that means, and a lot of times, in terms of why we don't access services, because only 1 in 3 Black Americans actually access services. A lot of times it's because of stigma. A lot of times it's because of mistrust of the medical community. Anybody remember the Tuskegee experiment? That is one of the historical reasons why there's a lot of distrust in not only the medical community, but also that bleeds into the mental health community. And so again, thinking about if anyone in your conversations, wherever you go, says Black folks don't get mental illness, your response should be, yes, we do. Yes, we do. So let's take a moment to talk about stigma. I grew up in Sampson County, a little town called Autryville, just outside of Fayetteville, between Fayetteville and Clinton. And we didn't talk about it. I grew up with older parents. My sister is 19 years older than me. My brother is 17 years older than me. So they are the age of many of you. My sister just turned 67 and my brother just turned 65. And so my parents were older. My dad was born in 1925 and my mama in 1933. So they raised us the way that they knew. And we didn't talk about mental illness. And so how many of you grew up hearing folks talk about, Uncle June in the back room at Big Mama's house, right? Or cousin this, cousin X name, whatever. Or, what happened to this person? Oh, we sent them down to Mississippi to stay with Auntie. Or we sent her up north to stay with this person till they can get back on track, till they can get it together. And that's where stigma stems from. And so what I want us to really think about is that, mental health is essential. It's an essential part of our well-being. So we all have mental health, right? Just like we have physical health, but we want to make sure that we're staying well so that we don't develop mental illnesses. And so stigma, when we look at stigma, and I'm just going to put all of these up here, um, and talk about them briefly, just to say, oftentimes individuals, we think that people with a mental illness, you know, it makes us easy. It makes it easy for them to tell from normal people. So I can pick out this person that has depression, or that person has that mental illness. Not at all. Because I'm sure some of you probably would not have imagined that my family's experience with mental illness, that I just shared with you. Oftentimes people with mental illness should not be given responsibility. That's another stigma that we hear. Um, and we also feel that it's a lack of self-discipline, or they need to pray more. We need to go to church and have a better relationship with God. And we need to pray more. We need to have a better relationship with God. But we also need to talk about the fact that mental illness is a brain disease. And just as soon as we would send someone to their doctor to talk about their blood sugar, we need to recommend and suggest folks talk to their doctors about their mental health problems that they're experiencing. And so this is another just kind of graphic of stigma, three main components, stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And so once we have that stigma against individuals living with a mental illness, it does lead to stereotypes, because we have this image in our head as to what we think a person looks like that has a mental illness that is far from what is true. It does cause prejudice and negative attitudes, because it changes how we interact and how we view that individual. And we discriminate. There's a behavioral response. Um, and again, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand for this one, but just think back. Have you ever driven through downtown and you have, well, I'm just going to pick the Moore Square area, or you're walking downtown and you see someone that may look like in your mind that they have a mental illness, and you get a little closer to the edge of the sidewalk. That is because of the stigma, or of what we've been taught over the years, that is what mental illness is and what happens with the person that's living with that. So there are several ways that we can reduce stigma, and this conversation today is one of the major ones, is having conversations that bring awareness about mental illness, but also around stigmatizing language. And what I mean by that is, we all learned growing up, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? And so I am of the belief that that is actually backwards. Um, Words do hurt. And so thinking about, here in North Carolina, our weather changes seasons within in one day. Um, and then also within a week. And so oftentimes I've heard folks say, oh, this weather is so bipolar. So what does that mean, that the weather is bipolar? What are you saying? And so by using language like that, where we are in essence making a joke about an individual that's living with bipolar disorder, we're preventing them, and we're contributing to that stigma. So instead, let's just use words when we're talking about the weather. Call the weather what it is. This weather is unpredictable. That's what our weather is. It's unpredictable. An individual that lives with bipolar disorder is living with bipolar disorder. They're not bipolar. So rather than saying Ruby is bipolar, Ruby lives with bipolar. She has bipolar disorder. Because we want to make sure that we are keeping in the forefront that the person is still a person despite their illness. Educate yourself and others about the challenges of mental illness. And again, having conversations, and I'll have some resources that I'll share with Whitney after today's presentation, that will allow you to do some more research on your own, and learn more about mental illness, so that you can determine how you can best support individuals. But I think this third one, I think, is most important: being aware of our own attitudes and beliefs. And as we become aware of our own attitudes and beliefs as it relates to an individual living with mental illness, give yourself some grace, but also open up your heart and your mind to try to change that so that you can be more accepting, you can be more supportive and more welcoming to someone that that has a mental illness. So I want to talk about depression and anxiety because they are two of the most common mental illnesses in the Black community. And tell you the graphics that I'm sharing with you today. Most of the pictures are of my children, Tamron and Talia, because it tells part of their story. And for those of you that were on my presentation back in August with the Missionary Baptist Association, you'll see some of these pictures from that presentation. But this is my daughter, Tamron. We did this photo shoot back in 2015 after her hospitalization for major depression and suicidal intentions as a way of chronicling what it felt like for her and our family at that time. And so we know that depression and anxiety are the most common mental illnesses. We know that they have very similar signs and symptoms. And most often when we talk about individuals that have co-occurring disorders or two mental illnesses at the same time, it in many cases it is anxiety and depression. And so again, we're not training you to diagnose, we're not giving you tips to be able to say, okay, I think you're depressed. What I'm hoping that you'll take away from these definitions that I'm giving you and these signs and symptoms is simply increasing your noticing skills. Being able to say, I noticed that Whitney is starting to, withdraw from her family relationships. It's starting to impact her ability to live, laugh, love, and learn. So I'm going to reach out and have a conversation with her to see how I can support her. So when we look at major depression, it lasts for at least 2 weeks. And so, yes, we all have periods of sadness, but if it lasts for at least 2 weeks and it starts to affect a person's ability to live, laugh, and love, then we should encourage them to start having conversations with their medical professionals so that they can develop a care plan to address those particular symptoms. And so, what does it look like? This is my daughter Talia talking about, how she felt alone when we were in the journey with Tamron, and when after her hospitalization. So what does it look like? So I've broken it down into three categories. Physical is the first one. And so when we look at this, how many of you have seen the Cymbalta commercials that have the person dragging the blanket and they're laying in bed or laying on the couch, right? We see that a lot. There is fatigue associated with depression. However, depending upon the age of the individual, it may not be just fatigue. So there is fatigue, there's a lack of energy. Person may sleep a lot or not at all. And then some of the other physical symptoms that we may see there, unexplained aches and pains at the bottom of that list. And so I can tell you from my personal experience, I have had days where, yes, I have hurt. My body has hurt. And so just paying attention. So as folks are talking about, I'm not feeling well, start asking questions. What's going on? What's bothering you? What are you feeling? What are some of those symptoms? Because that helps you gather information to determine how you can support them and whether or not you need to have a conversation with them about connecting to their healthcare professional. Behavioral symptoms that we may see or signs that we may see or symptoms that a person may feel are listed here. So crying a lot, withdrawing from others, neglecting their responsibilities. So if you know that there's an individual in your circle that loves their yard work, they keep their grass cut, they keep their flowers fresh and new, they're cycling them out on a regular basis, and that starts to change, that's a sign that you might want to check in with that person to see what's going on. It may not be a mental health problem that's happening, but it could be a physical illness that's happening. But the thought is you notice that something is there, and when you reach out and start to ask questions about how they're feeling, then you may be able to determine what's bothering them. Some of the psychological signs and symptoms that we see with depression are listed here. And I'm going to highlight two of these, well, three. Anger and mood swings. Most folks, when they think of depression, they think of the Cymbalta commercial that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And they think about the people dragging around. For my daughter, Tamron, her depression was anger and mood swings. I mean, we're talking at the age of 5, flipping couches over. We had a small love seat in our apartment at that time, and she would get mad and she'd flip it over. You saw in the picture on the slide coming into this section, there were holes in the wall. She kicked the hole in that wall with her foot because she was upset that I left her to go to an event when she wasn't ready when I asked her to be ready. So don't let our perceptions of what we think depression looks like keep us from reaching out, because it can show up as anger and mood swings, especially in young children. The other thing that I think I'll point out on this particular slide when we talk about psychological, because we'll talk about this a little bit later, are thoughts of death and suicide. That is a sign and a symptom that an individual may be experiencing depression. All right, so let's take a moment to talk about anxiety. As I mentioned, anxiety disorder does differ from normal stress and anxiety. Yes, you may have periods of anxiousness, but again, when we look at the impact that it has on your ability to go to work or school, carry out satisfying relationships or daily activities, that's when we're looking at it being more of a disorder as opposed to just one particular instance. And this is my other daughter, Talia. And I chose this picture because this was taken after she had done a virtual interview for an internship through her high school. She has anxiety disorder, and she is in her blanket in the recliner, and you can't tell it really unless you look really closely, but her eyes are red. She had been crying. She made it through the interview, but she was so anxious at the end. She came and sat in this chair and just cried her little eyes out. And so, again, this sometimes happens with individuals that may be experiencing anxiety. So, same categories, physical and behavioral. So, physical signs and symptoms of anxiety are listed here. And so, if you first glance at this list, when you look at pounding heart and chest pain, fast breathing, headache, dizziness, sweating, that looks like a heart attack, right? And so just being aware of these signs and symptoms and reaching out to a person and saying, okay, I'm concerned and I'm not sure if you're having a heart attack or a panic attack. So you go ahead and call 911. That's the first thing that you do. Or you can ask them, have you had panic attacks before? And if they say yes, okay, then you don't have to call 911 necessarily. You can stay with them. But if you don't have a good idea if they've had panic attacks before, I'd rather call 911 and talk through some of those signs and symptoms so that they can determine, as the healthcare professional, the next steps on how to treat an individual. Some of the behavioral signs and symptoms look, again, very much like what we saw with depression, avoiding situations. You may see obsessive or compulsive behaviors, so fixations on patterns and checking locks and rechecking locks. And then some types of phobic behavior. And it doesn't necessarily mean phobia of like snakes or spiders or things like that. It could be just phobia of, afraid of leaving the house. There is an anxiety disorder where individuals are afraid and have the phobia of leaving the house, and it's called agoraphobia. So just thinking about that. And so if you have a person that's withdrawing and they're experiencing some of these behaviors, checking in on them, letting them know that you're there to support them, and asking them how you can support them. What do they need from you is important, so that they have that voice in that process. Some of the psychological symptoms of anxiety are listed here. I think, most of the ones that we often think about are those unrealistic and excessive fear and worry about past events. So things that have happened. Um, Maybe let's say it's a student, they failed a test last week, and now they're excessively worrying about that test. Or it may be that their fear is worrying about passing tests in the future. And so just keeping that in mind, it could be based on the past or future events. There is decreased concentration, lots of indecisiveness. And then again, like we saw with depression, we see that irritability again as well. And then there can be some fatigue. And thinking back to the picture I just showed you of Talia, that fatigue coming in after she had that interview. And so this gives you kind of a snapshot of what you might see as a sign for a person that's experiencing depression and anxiety, and then what they may feel as a symptom as well. So, as you're having conversations with folks, and as you're asking them, are you okay? Tell me what's going on. Um, and you hear them talk about some of these symptoms, do a little bit of digging, having more in-depth conversations with them, and making suggestions or asking them, have you talked to anyone about this before? If you're talking to a friend and they've said, I'm just, it's hard for me to get out of bed, I can't keep up with my housework in today's time of everybody working from home during COVID-19, having children at home all day long, the social unrest that's around us, it's easy for us to feel a lot of these signs and symptoms that we've just talked about with depression and anxiety. And so as you're talking about that and you hear folks mentioning some of those stressors that they're feeling, ask them, have you had a conversation with your doctor about how you're feeling? Because oftentimes what we know is that an individual may be hesitant to reach out to a mental health professional. And so it's absolutely okay for them to start with their regular doctor, their primary care physician. There's trust there. They're likely to have conversations and open up with them. And the medical professional, that primary care doctor, can then make the suggestion for them to look into reaching out to a mental health professional. We also know that if an individual um, is in need of mental health services, they're more likely to reach out to a mental health professional if someone they know and love suggests it. And then one other thing that I'll mention, it kind of relates to stigma. And when we talk about these signs and symptoms, I've had folks say in my life before, why don't you just let me know what you need? Why don't you just reach out for help? Why don't you go see somebody? Because when you are in the depths of depression and anxiety, you can't. It's not that you don't want to. Your mind and your body, you can't. You cannot imagine how you can just take that extra step to reach out to someone. So don't say to someone, just go get some help. Say to that person, I am concerned about you. I'm really worried about some of the things that you've said the last few times we've talked. And you might want to just have a conversation with your doctor about what you've been feeling. So don't put the onus on them to say, go get help, go get some help. If you need something, let me know. Why don't you just go see your doctor? You make that suggestion to them. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about suicide. And then we have a couple other topics that we want to talk about before, as we wrap up. But as we move into this segment, I want to make sure that just to remind you that if you start to feel uncomfortable during this conversation, please message one of the health and wellness committee members so that they can support you. I really want to create that safe space. And I'm also going to put in the chat a resource that you can use as well. It's a crisis text line. You can, if you need it today or any other time, it will be on the resource list that I send you, but you can text MHFA to the number 741-741, and you will be connected with a crisis text line worker. And then the other number that I'll put in the chat, again, that will be in the resource list, is the Suicide Prevention Hotline. And because I'd rather you have these numbers and not need it than to need them and not know where to find them. Suicide is a hard topic. Having had my daughter deal with suicidal ideations, having had my husband deal with suicidal ideations, having trained over 600 people in mental health first aid where we talk about suicide, this conversation never gets easy. It doesn't get any easier. But what I do find that has happened over time is that I do feel a little bit more confident in sharing information with folks because I know what our story is and where our story could have ended. Um, so if you have been impacted with mental illness, with suicide, and if you've lost someone to suicide, I want to say before we go any further that I am so very sorry for your loss. But I hope that you today, if you haven't heard this before, give yourself some grace. Your loved one would want you to heal and move forward. You can think about, what I missed. How did I miss it? Why didn't I see it? But at the end of the day, you didn't see it because you were too close to it. And I'm speaking from the education perspective of what I know, but also am speaking from personal experiences. The pictures on this slide are from my daughter's journal. At 11, um, started at age 10, where we were having some turbulent times in our home and we were arguing. And I grew up again with older parents where you gonna beat it out of them. They gonna act right. And I remember one morning I said to her, we were arguing and she was getting ready for camp. And I said, "What is wrong with you, Tamron?" And she throws this black notebook at me and she said, "This is what's wrong." And this is a journal. And I'm just the reason I'm telling this story, because this was the day that I learned that my child was suicidal and I didn't see it coming. So this journal, she says, this would make my family happy. And what we see here, this little thing is a knife that's got blood on it. So this is the blade of the knife here. That's the handle. This page, she says, love is weakness. Don't ever love anybody. You can only depend on you. And then this bottom picture is her standing up. She's got a black blot in the middle of her chest, and it says, "My heart is a black hole. I am fat." And then I am a not so nice word here. And so when I tell you I would have missed it, I thought my child was just being difficult because she was being a hard-headed 10-year-old, 11-year-old. My child was sick. But I was in that situation because I was looking at it from mama's perspective, not from Ruby, the mental health educator. And so that's why I say to you, if you've lost someone to suicide, give yourself some grace. Don't think about the what ifs. Don't dwell on the what ifs, because you did the best that you could at the time that you had. And so I want to talk about some of these numbers. So this gives us all ages in the United States. So this is based on 2018 numbers. So 43,884 people died by suicide in 2018. And then you have the breakdown of males and females. So this is out of a population of 267 million people. 43,000 of them died. When we look at the Black community, in 2018, we had 3,124 deaths by suicide. That's out of a population of 42 million. And so even though it's 7.8%, when we only make up 17% of the population, 13% of the population, I think it was 13% of the population. Almost half of that we've had loss to deaths by suicide. And if you've noticed when I've talked about suicide this last couple minutes, it has been died by suicide or deaths by suicide. And changing that language that I talked about earlier, it's critical in when we talk about suicide, especially. You commit crimes, you commit sins, you commit adultery. We don't commit suicide. We die by suicide. You die by cancer. So you don't say you commit cancer. So we want to change that language because we want to remove the negativeness away from that. Individuals that die by suicide do so because they are mentally ill. They are mentally unwell. So I want to look at youth. And the reason that I picked youth for this particular segment is because in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge increase in suicides in Black youth. So when we look at all youth in the country, in 2017, it was the second leading cause of death for those aged 10 to 19. Second leading cause behind automobile accidents. Suicide. Children are taking their lives as the second leading cause. When we look at that number in Black youth, for males and females under the age of 13, Black males and females under the age of 13, they're 2 times more likely to die by suicide than their white peers. And then our Black boys, 5 to 11, they're more likely to die by suicide compared to white boys, 5 to 11. And so having conversations with our children, paying attention to what's going on in our children's lives, we've got to do it. And these numbers to speak to some of that. There is a study that's called the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey that's done across high school students nationally. And the resource list that I have will have the link to where you can look at North Carolina specific data. But when we look nationally at Black high school students from 1991 to 2007, this is what we see. There's been a 73% increase, 73% increase in suicide attempts from 1991 to 2017. Injury attempts for Black males, 122%. Look at those numbers. Our children are hurting. There are things that are happening to them, adverse childhood experiences. There are environmental issues that are happening, the social injustices that are happening, mental illness in our Black children. These numbers are alarming. And as for those of you that work with youth in the church and in your community, we need to start having conversations and checking in on them and letting, especially our Black males, know they can cry. It's okay to cry. It's okay to talk about their feelings, because when they don't do those things, these are the numbers that we see. This is what we see happen. So we've got to create and start normalizing conversations with our young people about this. When we look at 2018 for youth, it was the third leading cause for ages 15 to 19 and second leading cause for ages 10 for 10 to 12 in 2018. So we see some shifts in those numbers. But the top part of this slide, when we look at these Black high school students, suicide death rate in Black youth is increasing faster than any other racial or ethnic group. Increasing faster for our Black kids than any other racial group in the country. So we've got to have conversations about the things that our youth are dealing with and letting them know that they have supports and helping them identify those supports. Because oftentimes, one of the things that that Tamron told me was, I felt alone. She felt alone. And so they may be surrounded by lots of people, but because of the illness that they have, they still feel alone in this. And because of that reason, may take their life. So some of the risk factors that's associated with the individual dying by suicide are listed here. We know that if they have another mental illness, they are at an increased likelihood of dying by suicide. If they've experienced a traumatic event, exposure to violence, and yes, exposure to racial inequality does put them at greater risk as well. One thing that's not listed on here is that if they have lost a loved one or a friend to suicide, so if they've had someone close to them die by suicide, they are at greater risk themselves. And so we've talked about, the reasons for mental illness. We've talked about some of the risk factors for suicide. How can we protect our not just our children, but how can we protect those around us and reduce the likelihood that they may take their life? And so here are some suggestions here from Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. It's all about that support, having that support. A few years ago, when one of the reports came out about the adverse childhood experiences study, Oprah did this documentary about that and kind of went to various parts of the country. I remember her going to Milwaukee, in particular, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she kind of talked about, she had an aha moment. And she realized that one thing, as she had done research and talked to folks for that documentary, one thing that kept coming up to the top of the list that reduced the likelihood that not only would prevent or reduce the likelihood of a person dying by suicide, but also reducing the likelihood of them developing a mental health problem is connecting to one adult, one person, having a close relationship with one person. And so thinking about, helping individuals, adults and children identify their village. We've all, in the Black community, we love to take that phrase, it takes a village. It takes a village. We need to go back to that village mindset and helping individuals identify their village so that they can have that support. Other protective factors are access to professional help. And we know that because of distrust in the healthcare community, we're less likely as Black Americans to access professional help. And then when we do access professional help, we have difficulty identifying therapists that are culturally sensitive, that are culturally responsive. And so it's imperative, just like we do research on the doctor that we go to for if we're going to have an oncologist, we do research on them. We do research on any other type of specialist. We need to do research on the mental health professionals that we see to make sure if we don't have access to people that look like us, that the folks that we do see that don't look like us are culturally responsive. And so they are willing to sit in their uncomfortable space and hear me talk about my life as a Black woman in 2020 and the challenges that brings. So having those hard conversations with that professional help, and then thinking about also self-help strategies. So it may be walks, it may be your coloring, it may be just spending more and more time praying and being with God and being in the Word. Whatever those things are that can help you stay well. And then also cultural and religious beliefs can be protective factors. I know in our journey in our family, especially the 10 days that Tamara was hospitalized, I prayed a lot. But I also knew that my child was where she needed to be to get the help that she needed while she was hospitalized. And so what I want to say to you is that mental illness and faith can walk alongside each other, and it should walk alongside each other, and because it can be a protective factor. But I also want to say the reason it has an asterisk here is because religious beliefs can also be a risk factor because of the stigma that's in various faith communities. So just being aware of that, and trying to make changes to the risk that it could cause. So I want to spend just a few minutes looking at some of the warning signs, and then we're going to move into how to help and have some time for questions. So some of the warning signs for an individual that is living with, that may be considering suicide. You may see some of the things here. So that first one is what we saw with Tamron. Well, we didn't see it in the beginning. We saw it the day that we found out that she that she was indeed suicidal. She had been keeping that journal. So if you hear them talking about it, though, if they're talking about dying, and it may not necessarily be, I wish I was dead. They could say something like, I could probably disappear tomorrow and nobody would ever know. So being in tune to what folks are saying to you. Um, if they're looking for a way to kill themselves, that means they're collecting pills. If you're noticing that they're collecting weapons, so they're collecting means to kill themselves, that's a warning sign. If they talk about feeling worthless or having a lack of purpose, and that may sound like, I'm just not a help to anybody anymore. Um, I'm more of a burden. I'm more of a problem, and so it would just be better off if I weren't here. You see an increase in substance use. Some of the behaviors may change. They may become more agitated. You may see them in more reckless behaviors. They may withdraw oftentimes, but they also can be showing rage. And so, one of the things that I want to say, regardless of what signs or symptoms that you see or hear them describe, pay attention to them. If they say one time or 15 times that I'm thinking about killing myself, or I wish I was dead, or you don't want me anymore, so I'm just gonna kill myself. Don't dismiss that. Don't go to don't go to the mindset of the boy that cried wolf. Reach out to them each of those times and let them know that you're concerned. Use that suicide prevention hotline number while you're there with them. Give them the number and the text line themselves so that they can have that available to them. But if you notice that they are, let's say, really sad, they're talking about dying, they start to give away things that they love. If you know, I'm going to use, I see my friend Erica on the call, on the call. So if you know Erica loves her shoes, and Erica starts giving Whitney her shoes, she starts giving Miss Lindsay her shoes, that's the sign that you need to start having a conversation with Erica. How are you doing? Are you okay? I noticed that you've been giving away your shoes, and that's not like you. What's going on? Having that conversation, paying attention to those signs. But if you notice that after a period of time that behavior changes and they seem to be more upbeat, that dramatic change in mood, right? They're very happy now. They're not sad anymore. They're talking to folks again. Most of us are inclined to be like, okay, phew, thank goodness he's not thinking about killing himself anymore because he's in a better mood. Don't let that guard down, because when you see that dramatic change in mood, oftentimes what that means is that they've made peace with that decision. They've made peace, they've accepted it. They feel like they have everything in order for their loved ones that they're going to leave behind, and they are moving forward with that decision. So pay attention to that dramatic change in mood and don't let your guard down. So looking at how to help, that's one of the most important things. I've said, this is what it looks like. These are things you need to pay attention to. And so how do you help? And I'm addressing this from an individual perspective, but also from your church's perspective. So as a faith community, how can you help after today? And so starting off, for first and foremost, are knowing the facts, knowing what you need to know as it relates to mental health problems in individuals. And there are a couple ways that you can do that. There's a training that's called Mental Health First Aid. So it's kind of like, I call it the mental health version of CPR first aid. And so it trains individuals that are not healthcare professionals. So this is a community training. It trains you to recognize signs and symptoms of a mental illness or developing mental health crisis, and how to talk to a person while they're experiencing that, and how to connect them to the appropriate professional help. So that's a training that's available to individuals. There's also a training that was developed specifically for African American churches by NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, that's called Sharing Hope. And so this training pairs up an individual with lived experience, so an individual that's living with some type of mental illness or substance use disorder, as well as a family member and caregiver that has supported someone living with a mental illness or substance use disorder. And they do this presentation. I think it's in like an hour and a half presentation, but it specifically speaks to mental illness and how to share hope from the Black church perspective. It's important that we listen first to a person. So when they start talking about the feelings that they're having, don't go into, okay, let me fix it mode. Practice what I call the ministry of presence, just being present with them, sitting there with them, listening and hearing what they're saying, and doing so without judgment. So they may say things that that may make you uncomfortable, but don't allow your judgments to impact that conversation. They've broached a topic that's very difficult for them, and they're trusting you with that conversation. So try to listen without judgment. Speak very respectfully, but also create safe environments, not only for the individuals that are living with mental illnesses, but their families and caregivers. So those of you that may have a loved one that lives with a mental illness, you get dragged right along with them. And it's hard. It's very isolating because we feel, we're in this and folks are going to judge us. They're going to say, I'm not a good mama because my child was suicidal. They're going to say, I'm not a good wife because my husband was suicidal. And so creating that safe space for individuals living with an illness as well as their family members, it's very important. So going back again to that, that village. Other ways that we can help are listed here. Have realistic expectations, and particularly with an individual that has a substance use disorder, which I didn't spend much time talking about. But there's another huge stigma around substance use in the Black community, whether it's a real mental illness or not. It is a brain disorder, but having realistic expectations. So if it's someone that has an alcohol problem, they're drinking alcohol excessively, in your mind you may say, well, just stop drinking. So is it realistic to tell someone that is dependent upon alcohol to just stop drinking? Or is it more realistic to say, reduce the amount of alcohol that you're using? And so don't let our picture of what we think recovery looks like to be projected onto an individual. A reduction in use of substance is recovery in the mental health world. Understand that the symptoms are distress are part of the illness, and they're not projected at you personally, and they are not the person. I am still Ruby. I just live with depression, and sometimes my depression looks like anger and frustration, and I project that onto other people. And so it's not personally directed at you. It is an expression of that illness that I live with. Provide practical help. And you can do so in various ways, but two that I mentioned here are developing a list of community resources that are available to support individuals that are living with mental health problems, and also a list of culturally responsive therapists. So start making that list of Black therapists in the community that folks can reach out to. If there are, if you know of non-people of color that are therapists, but they are culturally responsive, add them to that list, because I don't want a person not accessing services because they can't necessarily get to a Black therapist. But if we have a non-person of color that is culturally responsive, and you've had conversations with them and you know that they have had training and they've done their research on how to treat various cultures, add them to your list as a resource. And then one of the last things that I'll talk about here is, what if a person doesn't want help? I know that's a question you'll get. And so what I'll say is find out why, asking questions around, I noticed some hesitation, or you don't seem like you want to make this call. What are you thinking? What's causing that hesitation? Maybe it's fear, maybe it's shame, maybe just them calling the number on themselves is so much anxiety for them. Then you make the offer to call the number for them while they're there. You make the call with them. If it's access, try to identify solutions for paying for healthcare services, those mental health services. There are agencies that provide services on a sliding scale basis. Maybe that's something that you decide that you partner with other community agencies to develop a fund that provides stipends to support access to mental health care. We've talked about the resources, identifying the resources. And so if they don't want help when you're talking to them, don't just write them off. Meet them where they are and say, I'm concerned about you and I understand you don't want to talk about this right now. You don't want to get help, but know that I'm here to support you. And here's a list of resources that you can use whenever you're ready. That's the important thing. Leave that door open for them. And then if you need to engage professional help in an emergency, call 911. If you know there's someone that you are interacting with that is actively suicidal, especially, call 911, call the suicide prevention hotline so that you can get the help that they need. And let's see here. I want to give one example of some things to say. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of these and then jump forward a couple of slides to give us plenty of time for question and answer. And so here's just some examples of how you can talk to someone. It's awkward. It is uncomfortable. Yes, I will admit that. So here are some examples that you can ask. I haven't heard you laugh in a while. Is everything okay? I'm worried about you and want to know what's going on so I can help you. Those are just a couple of examples. On this slide, you can tell me anything. I won't judge. I'm not going to judge you. And as you're saying these things, think about your nonverbals. Think about your nonverbals. Those that your eyes and your body language speak before your mouth ever opens. I like the next one. Maybe it's just me, but I was wondering if you were all right because I just have this feeling that something's bothering you. Do you want to talk about it? And then the last one, seems like you haven't seems like you haven't been yourself lately. What's up? What's going on? And so by using statements like this, it does two things. It lets the person know, number one, that you are paying attention, that you are aware that they're acting differently, because they may think nobody is paying attention. And by doing that, you open the door for conversations with them about what they may be experiencing. And then the last slide that I'm going to show here is there's hope. This was at the end of the photo session that we did in 2015. We were better at that day. That was January 2015. She was hospitalized in July 2014. We were in a better place that day than we were July 21st, 2014, but we still had a ways to go. So by having these conversations with individuals, letting them know that there is hope, that they are not alone in this, and they will get through this, that they can move to the road of recovery. This was in May of 2015. My babies had their smiles coming back. And then the road to recovery continues to do well. This was the beginning of their senior year back in August. Again, it's been a bumpy road. It will be a bumpy road for many of us, but letting folks know that we are in it. We're to use the phrase that my kids will say, and you may have heard some young folks say, I'm their ride or die. I'm their ride or die. I'm on this bumpy road. There are going to be days that you may think you can't make it, but you have your village. So define that village so that you can get the support that you need to make that ride and that road to recovery a little less bumpy, so that you can live in wellness and do what it is that God has put you on this earth to do. So, Whitney, I am going to, excuse me, stop sharing my screen and open it up. I know you've got tons of questions. I saw my little light popping up down there. And so, what I'm going to do, I'm going to allow you to unmute, Whitney, and then I'll just take the questions from you.
Oh, wow. Thank you. This was so, the information was very informative. Thank you so much for sharing and your willingness to want the community to know better and to do better. So, yes, I'm going to start with the questions from the chat, and I'm going to read them how
Okay.
they came in.
Okay.
So, the first question was, what about self-injurious behavior? Cutting in the Black community. Have you seen this in teenagers?
Yes. So non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. It's not a mental illness. It's a it's a negative coping mechanism for dealing with an underlying illness or underlying distress. And we do see it in teenagers and in the Black community. And oftentimes we most commonly hear about cutting. I remember growing up, and one of my mom's sisters had an alcohol problem, and she was cut from this wrist to her elbow on both arms. And at that time, you know, my mom, the stigma played a big part. Oh, she just cuts when she gets drunk. There's nothing wrong with Marianne. But now what I know is that oftentimes that's the way that an individual releases stress and frustration. My daughter Tamron, 2 years ago, started cutting. And what we learned over time through therapy was that because we have focused so long on her not lashing out at others, not throwing things, not punching walls, not cussing at me, her dad, and her sister, she started focusing on injuring herself. So her response was, "Well, I'm not hitting y'all. I'm not cussing at y'all." So that was how she was dealing with that underlying distress. And so other self-injurious behaviors can be picking hair out, um, eraser burns on your skin. There are individuals that over exercise. And so I had someone tell me a couple years ago in a training that they had a student in their class to exercise 6 times a day, 7 days a week. That is not healthy. And so anytime it's in excess, it is a self-injurious behavior. So the intent is not to kill themselves. It is to release stress and pressure that they're feeling. Sometimes folks have described it as, you know, your old school pressure cookers when you pop them and it goes psh. That cut, each cut that they feel, that they experience, it feels like pressure being released. And so it's their way of letting out that pressure that they're experiencing.
Okay, Mrs. Ruby, this next question is a three-part, so I'll just read each one and wait for you to answer.
Thank you.
Are statistics on mental illness any different among Christians?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know that I found any data specific to that, but I'm willing to dig around and see what I can find and share that back with Whitney to pass along.
Churches, what should be the church role?
Excuse me. I think the church's role really should be normalizing conversations about mental illness. And so instead of saying, and this is what I'm sure y'all haven't heard this at Oak City Baptist, but I can tell you what I've heard back at Elizabeth, back in Archerville, they gonna go to hell, right? And so thinking about the power of that statement for somebody that is really sick, that is really in a low place to the point even where they're talking about taking their lives, to hear someone that they feel that they are connected to in a space that means so much to them, being the church, pass that judgment with such a strong statement can really impact them. So my mama's response to that statement one time when a lady said that was, well, you don't have a heaven or a hell to put them in. So we need to support them where they are. We can talk to them about the goodness of God, but also encourage them to reach out to a mental health professional that's trained to deal with mental health problems. So normalizing conversations, creating that safe space where people can talk about it. So if I come in and I start talking to Whitney about, my family's experience with depression and my family's experience with suicide, that Whitney doesn't shut down and be like, oh my goodness, we're not talking about this, but that she just sits in that space and has that ministry of presence and spends that time with me.
Okay. The next question is, the slide has injury attempts increased by 122% for Black males. What kind of injury attempts should we look for?
That's a really good question. So injury attempts can be anything from excessive drug use to erratic behavior. So, driving really fast in cars, unsafe behaviors where let's say they're riding bicycles in the middle of traffic. So think about, unusual behaviors like that. Also, accessing means to things like guns. If they start to become fascinated with weapons, that's a sign that we need to start having conversations about. So looking for access to means, or even pills, for instance. If you're noticing that pills are going missing, start having questions with them.
What do you do when someone is in denial about having a problem?
That's a good question too. So what I'd say to that is simply say to the person what you've noticed. I've noticed this. We call it I statements. And so I would say to my friend Erica, I noticed that you're not coming to church as much as you used to. Is everything okay? So state what you know. Don't say, Erica, Manya told me you weren't coming to church. What's going on? Because then it becomes, okay, y'all talking about me, right? And so stick to what you know, what you've noticed, how you've noticed that they've changed. And if they say, I don't want to talk about it, I don't have a problem, you can't force them to believe that they do have a problem. So you let them know, I'm concerned and I'm worried about you. And when you're ready to talk, let me know I'm here. Leave that door open, but don't force them, because you don't want them to pull back too far to where they don't reach out to anybody.
This information is valuable. Sharing your personal experience makes this so relatable. How do we get this out to more churches in our community, those who miss this?
Well, thank you so much. I share my story because I hope that what you said happens. I want folks to be able to connect. I want folks to have a face to mental illness, because we know my daughter could have been dead and my husband and I would have missed it. And so this is our ministry in sharing our story and getting folks to have these conversations. And so what I would say is, NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, has a Wake County chapter, and they have individuals that have, they have this program that's called In Your Own Voice. So you can reach out to them, where they bring individuals in with lived experience. Now, what I don't know is how many of those individuals are Black folk. So, but reach out and ask the question, right? And try to access that resource. Because we're going to have this is recorded, it's going to be available. I am totally fine, and we can talk about this offline too, Whitney. You, me, and your pastor can talk about making this available on your website. For me, I just want people to hear the message, right? And so share this information. If there are other churches that want to do something similar, reach out to me. I'll be willing to talk with them, or even, you know, look at some other folks that might be available as well. And Manya, thank you for putting the NAMI link in the chat. I appreciate that.
This has been wonderful and informative. How can we find a list of African American or cultural supportive counseling or therapists?
Yep. So the resource list that I'll send to Whitney to share with everybody will have a couple of resources. There are a couple of groups that track Black therapists, and so that'll be on that resource list for you after the training today.
Okay. What do you do when individual is in group therapy but does not want to attend anymore because they feel like it's an attack on them, and everyone in the group is not feeling heard and think it's worthless to keep attending?
So one of the things to think about when you're accessing mental health care, especially group therapy, is making sure that it is a good fit, right? And so this individual may be at a place where, depending upon the time that they've been in this particular group, where they've just outgrown that group. And so it may be time to start having a conversation with the group leader to talk about your needs, where you are, and determine if there can be some adjustments to how the groups are run, or if you need to look at finding another group. But I also say that part of the process is being uncomfortable. And it's hard when we have other people pointing out things that they've noticed about us, especially if we're struggling with you know, understanding what we're dealing with ourselves. And so before you totally give up on that group, trust the process, know that it will be very uncomfortable, but that's part of healing. That is part of getting to wellness. It's going to hurt, and you've got to sit in that so that you can learn from that. We grow the most when we are most uncomfortable. And so sit in that. If it's attacked to the point where it's a negative attack towards you, then absolutely you need to look at moving to another group. But if it's an uncomfortable feeling because folks are pointing out things, or as I used to tell my daughter, people are calling you out on your stuff, be open. You need to have an open mind and be reflecting to what folks are saying that they've noticed in you. But if it's really from a point of just attacking in a bullying type way, have a conversation with that group lead and try to find, either have them address it within the group or try to find another group.
Impulsive gambling, substance abuse is a sign of which mental illness?
So substance abuse is an actual mental disorder itself. So as clinicians diagnose, they have this manual that they use, but substance use is a diagnosable mental illness itself. Compulsive gambling is a type of disorder as well. So you can be diagnosed. So it's not a sign and a symptom. Those are actual diagnoses. Now, substance use can be a sign and symptom of like depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder, but it is also a standalone mental illness.
What's the best stance when a person becomes argumentative in group settings? What's the best way to deflect situations without offending the person?
So I think go back to that first slide that I talked about. Think back to that focused on, that had the anger outside. So instead of focusing on, and I'm going to pull it up real quick just to remind you. So instead of focusing on the anger, focus on what may be causing it. All right. So hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. Maybe not. Whitney, are you seeing pictures of yourselves, or are you seeing my slide?
Your slide.
Okay. I just want to make sure because I don't see my little green box around my stuff. So focus on what's in this will and what may be causing it. Now, if it is a group setting, the person that's leading that group should stop the group and address the behavior, because groups should have safe spaces, and there should be expectations that each group member agrees to at the beginning of each session. So if that's not happening, then you need to have a conversation with the mental health professional that's leading that group around those group rules so that they create that safe space. But don't attack them back. That we don't want to do the eye for an eye thing. But have the conversation with the group leader.
Thank you for sharing. It is a journey for me. My daughter is 22 with 2 children, and I have concerns of her care for herself and the children. What do I do? This is so real, the story you are telling with your kids. I keep thinking about what did I miss as a parent. Are there any support groups for parents of children, adults suffering from mental illness?
Yes. So I'm going to start with the parent piece first. And what did you miss? So I will say to you, as a parent, try as best you can not to think about the what ifs, because like I mentioned, you are in the middle of it from a mama's perspective, a parent's perspective, a dad's perspective. So you're doing the best that you can with what you knew at that moment. Today, hopefully you've learned some information that will help you think differently. So give yourself some grace. You did the best that you could with what you knew. There are some parent support groups. There is a great group that NAMI does. It's not a support group, but it's more of an education group. But it kind of morphs into an unofficial support group, because when you're in a space with parents that are experiencing similar things that you're dealing with, you start to lean on each other and support each other. But it's called NAMI Basics. And I'll make sure that it's listed on the resource list that I send out to the group afterwards as well, because it can be a great resource, not only to help you learn more about what you may be dealing with your child, even as an adult, but also you connect with other parents that have gone along a similar journey. And then what was the first part of that question?
She just wanted to know, I have concerns of her care for herself and the children. What do I do?
And so I would say, use your I statements. And so finding a time to have a conversation with her about what you're seeing and what makes you concerned. And it's important not to do it at a time where emotions are heightened. So if you're in the middle of an argument, that is not the time to try to have this conversation. Find quiet time where the two of you can sit down and talk about, and you speak to what you've noticed, what you've seen, and let her know why you're concerned, and do it in a non-judgmental way. And say, you can say something to the effect of, I can only imagine how hard it is for you, especially now with two children in this pandemic. But I am really concerned about your well-being. And I just want you to know that you can talk to me about anything that you're dealing with, and I can help support you. And so just opening that conversation and doing it from a friendly mother's perspective. And it is a struggle. I can tell you, I still struggle with it right now with my own two, but approaching it from, I'm just mama having a conversation because I'm worried about my baby. And this is what I'm noticing, and this is why I'm concerned.
So that is all the questions that I have that are in the chat. But if anyone wants to vocally ask their questions, you can do so at this time. But remember to unmute yourself.
Hey, this is Erica Johnson. I just have a question. What do you do whenever you have individuals that can acknowledge their bad behavior for years, but you see no actions, and then when you address the issue, they'll say, I'm not in denial, but they're still doing it.
Yeah. So I can give you an example of kind of what I have said to folks in the past. And you could say something again, it's thinking about not only what you say, but how you say it, right? Because depending upon the person and where they are in acknowledging this and trying to determine, do I get help? What does it look like? And so what you can say is, you know, we've talked about this a couple of times, and you've shared with me that you recognize that this is a problem. I am really concerned, and I want you to know that I will go with you. I will help you get the help that you need. And just because you are reaching out for help doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you are weak. It just means that you need some support for short. It could be short term, just to help you manage some of the things that you're dealing with. Because I think sometimes folks think that if they reach out for mental health services, that they're always going to be in therapy or they're always going to have all of these medications. Most individuals only need therapy or medication for a short period of time. And so just letting them know that, number one, it's not a reflection on them as an individual. It doesn't mean that they're not a good person. It doesn't mean that they're weak, because that's where that stigma comes in. And so by acknowledging that during that conversation, hopefully that will help them feel a little bit more comfortable. But even if they're not, Erica, leave that door open. Um, but what could happen to sometimes in situations like that, it's like they keep reaching out and they keep pulling you in, but they don't want to make any change. And it's okay to set boundaries with folks. And so you can say to that person, especially if this has been going on for a long period of time, is that, I really do care about you. And I hear you saying that you want to get help, but I'm not sure, or that you have a problem, but I have tried all of the things that I know for how to help you. And I just don't know if I'm the best person that can help you right now. But I am willing to connect you with somebody else that can support you in this process. But I've just got to take a break for a little bit. You can set those boundaries, because you don't want it to negatively impact your mental wellness in the process. Because sometimes as caregivers and taking care of folks that we love, we get sucked into this and we forget about our own mental wellness. And so it's important that we practice self-care, and boundaries are okay. It doesn't mean that you no longer care for that individual, Erica. It just means, I've got to tap out and take a break for a moment and focus on myself so that I can refill my cup to help the next person, or to help to be able to support you if you come back around and reach out to me. I am a firm believer in setting boundaries.
Thank you. Really appreciate the second part.
Yeah, but yes, boundaries. Please set boundaries, and you can do so in a way that is comforting and supportive. Any others?
So, Miss Ruby, I have a question. Can you give an example of how a leader could de-escalate a group setting if someone is argumentative? Have you ever been in that situation? Or if you were in that situation, how would you handle? Because you do want to still, keep a safe place and make the others feel comfortable.
Yeah. I think that, timeouts are good. And it's not always for 2 and 3-year-olds, right? And so let's take a break. Let's take a break. And, and I've said this in my own house. Okay, everybody in separate corners, everybody separate spaces. Take a break. If it's a group meeting, take a break. Do some deep breathing techniques, just so that everybody can kind of recenter themselves and regulate those emotions. Or just take a moment and just sit in quiet and allow folks to self-regulate that way. I would time folks out in a minute. Let's take a break. Let's pause, because emotions are getting a little high, and I want to make sure that we still have a safe space where everybody feels that they can be heard. If you set kind of expectations at the beginning of the meeting, I think that's an important thing that can be helpful to folks. regardless of the type of meeting that you're having, even if it's virtually, set expectations. And so, we're not going to talk over each other. We're going to respect each other's opinions, even if we don't agree with them. And so setting those expectations. And then if it continues, time out and you can stop the group meeting and resume at a later time.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So I have a question in the chat.
Mhm.
This is in the context of submission, the need to be in control.
Mm.
And that was a question. So the need to be in control. Be it the man or the woman, the idea of one being over the other. Is this a sign of mental illness?
Oh my goodness. Is it a sign of mental illness? It could be, but it may not necessarily be. And so it really is a gray area. So I think one of the most important things to think about again is what's driving that person to feel the need to have to be in control of every situation. What has happened? Has there been some relationship issue, some family situation, something at some point in their time in their life where they have felt like they have not been in control of the situation and it impacted them negatively? And so start again. A lot of it, and questions are hard to ask, especially when we're talking about control situations. But you can say something like, I'm just trying to understand what has happened or what's going on that's causing you to feel um, that you have to have control of every situation. And the reason that I'm asking that is because it's starting to negatively impact our relationship. And so give them, okay, I've noticed this, and this is why it's bothering me, because it's negatively impacting our relationship, because they may not even see it. But I do think that it could be a potential warning sign of an underlying mental illness, and what that is. It's up to the mental health professional to determine. But there's something that has happened along the way that has caused that person to feel out of control, and and they didn't like the way that it made them feel. So now they are going to prevent that by controlling everything that they touch. And so having difficult conversations, and if you're not comfortable having that conversation directly, then saying to them, particularly, I'm gonna use an example. Let's say it's a marital relationship, then absolutely reaching out and doing couples therapy so that a third party individual can help peel back the layers and get to what's causing that behavior.
Let me check this chat real quick. Okay, Mrs. Ruby, the question is, what if someone is talking over someone? Is this an abusive behavior that should be looked into?
If yes, if they're constantly talking over an individual, have a conversation, start to address, find out why they feel the need to do that. And you don't want to say, why you keep talking over me? Because that's going to cause you to escalate. And so at a time when everybody's emotions are much lower than in the middle of that disagreement, come back to and say, the other day when we were having this argument, I noticed that each time I tried to say something, you talked over me, and that bothered me a little bit. Can you tell me why you do that? And so it's important to remember that if we anytime we address negative behaviors like this, not to do it in the heat of the moment. Allow everybody to have some time just to process what happened, and then circle back around to it, because then you're able to think more clearly.
Okay, hold on. The questions, they're coming in.
They're coming in.
Okay. Is there a possibility for a person diagnosed be revisited once distributing other symptoms? Can it be evaluated again to see if things have been added or changed?
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to have an ongoing relationship with if you have a mental health diagnosis, especially, that you are constantly checking in with your mental health professional, letting them know of any new symptoms that you're experiencing. If you don't have a mental health professional and you're let's say it's depression and you're receiving medication from your primary care physician, letting them know. So just like when we go to the doctor and they say, well, has anything changed since the last time? Don't just think about those physical health symptoms. Think about some of those mental health symptoms that we've talked about. So anytime you notice a change, you need to let your mental health professional or your healthcare professional know so that they can address what's going on. Because it could be a variety of things. We know that, especially for individuals that are on medications, and I'm gonna approach the medication from this perspective. If you're on a medication for a physical illness like hypertension, like diabetes, it could impact. So if you ever looked at those little pamphlets that come in, they're like this long in your medication, all of these negative things that can happen. If you notice any of those signs and symptoms, you would let your doctor know about that. If it's your blood pressure medicine or your thyroid medicine is making those changes. So even on antipsychotic medications or other antidepressants, any type of psychological medication, if there is a change in your symptoms, let your healthcare professional know. If you're not on medication and you're noticing changes in your behaviors, your emotions, if they're more intense, especially, let them know so that they can reevaluate. It should be an ongoing process, just like you go back ever so often to have your A1Cs checked for your sugar. You should be doing the same thing with your mental health professional as well.
Okay, a question just popped up.
Okay.
Can you explain passive aggressive behavior in terms of how it can be emotionally and verbally abusive to others? And can that be an indicator of mental illness for a person who does this?
Okay. So passive aggressive behaviors are not always necessarily an indication that there's a mental health problem. Some people just have personalities where they like being passive aggressive. So it's just who they are. It's not anything to do with their mental illness. It's just a personality trait. That said, passive aggressive behavior is common in some mental health disorders, like bipolar disorder, especially. And there are some personality disorders where you may see that. So typically, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mental illness. It is a component, a symptom of some mental illnesses, but there are individuals, it's just part of their personality.
So a question came to me. How do you let someone know, or how would they know if they do have symptoms of bipolar?
And so with bipolar disorder, really thinking about, so bipolar is exactly what it is. It means two extreme poles. And so oftentimes you have an individual that's experiencing extreme periods of depression, so very low lows, and then they bounce back to the extreme elevated moods. So really, really low, really sad, to almost like the Energizer Bunny. They constantly going, they can go days without sleep. Their racing thoughts are some of the signs and symptoms that you see with that. And so when you're noticing that those swings are there, and they usually, it's not just they're sad this moment and then 2 minutes later they're in the extreme elevated mood. We're talking about in each pole for periods of time, so weeks and days on end usually. One example that I will say, and that's what with bipolar disorder especially, it's usually not diagnosed until individuals are about 15, 16 years of age. Number one, because adolescence, those of us that have had an adolescent in our house, typical adolescents, they can be sad and elevated mood, right? And so that's why we don't see the diagnosis until young people have moved through that adolescent period. But it's also very critical to have conversations with your healthcare professionals to get an official diagnosis for bipolar disorder, because it is so tricky to treat. And I will tell you, when my daughter first started, when we first started seeing some of the signs and symptoms in Tamron, and again, I was looking at this from mama's perspective. I was not huge in mental health education at that time. And I told her, Duke educated psychiatrist. Now, I'm not a clinician. I told her, Duke educated psychiatrist, this child is bipolar. I didn't even know I didn't even know better enough to say she has bipolar disorder. I was like, this child is bipolar, because how's she gonna be sad this morning or cussing me out this morning, and then the next 2 hours later she's up under me like nothing happened, right? And so as I learned more, I learned that, because she kept saying, oh, she has depression. She's not depressed. Depressed people don't throw stuff. They don't cuss people out. And so as I learned more, I learned that yes, in depression in children especially, you see that anger, you see that elevated mood. And so having conversations with your healthcare professional, your mental health professional especially, about what you're seeing and being truthful about it. And so when they ask you what you're seeing, what you've noticed, tell them everything, because you want them to recognize and diagnose you with what you really have, so that they can provide the best course of treatment. It's kind of like if you let's say you're diagnosed with cancer, and you're like, but you know what, I'm just gonna be good. We're not gonna do any chemotherapy. We're okay, think about that. What's going to be the outcome? And so the same thing, be truthful about the signs and symptoms that you're seeing and that you're experiencing, so that they can develop a good plan of care to treat those symptoms.
Okay. Any other questions that are in the chat, I will write them down. I will give them to Mrs. Ruby to address, and I will definitely give you an update on her response. But Ms. Ruby, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your guidance and your wisdom and your obedience to just spread the word and bring awareness to everyone. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for just being open to what I had to say. And I've seen some of the comments. I'm glad that my family's story resonated with you. But also hopefully that will help you then kind of think about how you as a person can better support those in your life that may be living with a mental illness. And again, I applaud your church and your leadership for addressing this topic, because it doesn't happen often enough.
Thank you. So this has been an event led by the Health and Wellness Ministry. We are here to bring awareness to the church. So if anyone happens to have an idea or a topic or concern that you would like to be addressed, please contact me or anyone that's on the Health and Wellness Ministry, and we will be sure to set up a Zoom, and so we can make sure we address the issue. So at this time, we're going to have our pastoral comments and our closing prayer by our very own Reverend William T. Newkirk.
Thank you so much, Sister Whitney. Good morning to everyone. And I know you can't say good morning back, but I'm so glad to see the 27 people who were with us this morning. A couple of people have already left, but thank you so much for being a part. We do honor the Lord, and we thank him for this wonderful session today. Thank you so much, Mrs. Ruby Brown Herron, for your expertise, your time, and sharing your experiences with us today. I have learned a lot.
Thank you so much.
I am not a counselor. I've had a course in it in seminary, but that's not going to help the kind of stuff we dealt with today. Thank you so much. This is such a broad area of issues that we've dealt with, and I have a feeling that there's even more to it. And it's such a pervasive area when it comes to the Black community. As a pastor, I'm concerned about the total person, not just the spiritual aspect, but all aspects, the physical, the emotional, the social, the mental, everything about a person. We want to make sure that person is whole, and that person is where the Lord can use them and where the Lord can direct them and bless them. And anytime there's a void in their lives, anytime there's a problem with whether it's emotional problem, whether it's a mental problem, whether it's a social problem, a physical ailment, we need to try to address it. And today, this area on mental illness, I want to thank you, Sister Whitney, for bringing this to us, you and your committee. Thank you so much for your leadership. But this area has been tremendous, and I'm just applauding Mrs. Herring for being such an expert in this area. Just listening to you and listen to the way you address the questions, and then the personal experiences you've had, you are really at the top of the line. I was asking the question at some point, who are some of the Black mental health professionals that we can refer people to? I'm gonna send them all to you because I like the way you approach issues, and I like the way you deal with issues. And I think you do have some certification in this area. Sister Manya Lindsay came back from a conference that she had someplace, and she heard you. She came back and shared with us how much she benefited from your presentation. And I'm so happy that the Health and Wellness Ministry brought you on board to share with us today. I have learned over the years to refer people. When I can't help them, I refer them to someone else. We're blessed to have someone in the area of counseling in our church that I can do that too, and also outside of the church. But I've learned to do that because I don't know it all. When it comes to some of the issues that you talked about, I let people know I'm a spiritual advisor. I'm not a counselor. I'll advise you spiritually. I cannot counsel you with some of the areas you're dealing with. So I give people scriptures, I help them, I pray with them. And quite often when people see me, they say, pray for me. And quite often I need to know, what do you want me to pray for? What do you do? What's the issue? When I went to school, I'm getting ready to close. When I went to school as a freshman over at St. Augustine's College at that time, our president, Prezell R. Robinson, gave us a speech, all the freshmen in the gym. And he said to us, I want you to look at the person on your left and the person on your right. He said, only 1 out of 3 of you will graduate 4 years from now. So look at the person on your left and your right. And I did it. And I felt sorry for each one of those persons because I knew I was going to graduate. And when I think about what you said today, 2 out of 9 Black people will have a mental illness problem. And so anytime 9 of us in a group,
Right.
1 of us will have a problem. So I think this is very helpful to us today. And this is not the end. This problem is so pervasive, we've got to continue with bringing in education, bringing in resources, bringing in people like you, Mrs. Herring, who can help us. Because it is in the church, just like it's in our homes, in our communities. I just read a magazine this past week where it talked about pastors and their families and how they are impacted with mental illness. And it also talked about other people in the church, how they're impacted. A quite revealing article. I won't get into the details. But again, thank all of you for being a part today. At this time, we're going to close with a prayer. Please be safe in this pandemic, in this environment of coronavirus. And it'll be a while before we can open our church doors. As you know, the virus is spreading in North Carolina now, and it's spreading in churches, people who've opened up their churches. So we're not going to open up until it's safe. Let us, in the meantime, be in prayer for one another. Did someone say something? All right, let us pray. Let's pray. Again, thank you, Ms. Herring. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sister Whitney. Lord, we thank and praise you for this very instructive and inspiring presentation today. Thank you for people like Sister Ruby Brown Herring, who can be helpful to us. Thank you for allowing her to come and share with us today. We thank you for the Health and Wellness Ministry as leadership for bringing us this great resource. We pray, oh God, for all of those who may have health problems, whether they be physical, whether they be mental, or whether they be in other areas. We pray for healing. We realize you are the great physician, and you heal not only physically, but you also heal mentally. Help us to keep our hand in your hand. Order our steps, O Lord, and lead us in the way that pleases you. And now, be with us in this pandemic. Keep us safe from any hurt, harm, or danger. Bless Mrs. Herring and her family, and bless all of those who've been a part of this presentation today. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the fellowship and communion of God's Holy Spirit be with all of us now, henceforth, and forever. And all of God's people said together, amen.
Amen.
And thank you, Pastor.
Hope you all have a blessed day.
God bless you.
Bye.
Bye.